That was marvelous, wasn't it? Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. Do you feel you've got that kind of God? Do you rejoice that you've got the freedom to worship him? I was out walking this morning. I like to walk morning and evening just to, keep some air going through the lungs, keep a little bit in my legs. And just to be out there walking along the promenade and the fresh air, the freedom to do it was wonderful. I met some of you there, and that was great. I saw some of you sitting on the promenade on the steps and praying, and that was great. To have the freedom to be able to pray, to do what you like, that's marvelous. This morning we're talking about freedom. I've entitled my presentation, A Matter of Conscience. I hope it's appearing on the screen because it's an illustrated presentation. There we go. I actually want to start with a quote that you know extremely well. Ellen White says, "We have nothing to fear for the future, lest we forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." And sometimes we actually do well to fear for the future. The EU are having some meetings this morning. I'm not sure what's going to turn up out of those meetings. We live in an uncertain world. Syria, Iraq, the Ukraine, the iron and clay of the EU, the uncertainty of the economy, the growing challenge of secularism, and its implications for religious freedom, religious expression, they all give us cause for concern. But let me give you the full quote here before I go into the main body of my presentation, because she says it with rejoicing. She says, "Praise God. As I see what the Lord has wrought, I'm filled with astonishment. And with confidence, with Christ as leader, we have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." We're looking back 100 years this morning. It's a slightly different devotional to normal. And if we go back 100 years to 1914, it might have been difficult for our church members to say praise God. 400 delegates were meeting at Battersea Town Hall for the British Union session the very weekend that World War I broke out. In their special prayer sessions that weekend, it wasn't so much praise God, but rather that the forces of strife may be restrained in Europe and that the lives of our brethren and the interests of the cause may be divinely guarded. They were fearful for what the future might hold, and particularly they were fearful for our young men, and they had good reason to fear. These young men, this is the carpentry workshop for ministerial trainees at what was then the British Union Training College, Stanborough College. Even before conscription was imposed in 1916, life was difficult for our Adventist men. Dr. Hugh Dunton was a conscientious objector in World War II. His father was a conscientious objector in World War I. And Dr. Dunton well remembered the scornful cries of "Conchi" in his school where he was teased and bullied because his dad would not fight. The calls as he walked down his village streets, even after the war was over. Life was difficult for people that chose to be pacifist rather than to fight. And it was difficult. Lord Kitchener's propaganda machine made Conchis very unpopular people. It was no joke for a young man when a young lady would come up to you maybe 2 or 3 times in the day on the street and give you a white feather as a sign that you're a coward. In January 1916, conscription was enforced. Thousands more troops were needed to fight in the trenches of the Western Front, and soon 130 young Adventists were called up for military service. At least one of them fought. You can see him there on the screen. That is M.J. Nichols. He was a former evangelist in Aberdare, and he joined the Herefordshire Light Infantry Regiment. However, most Adventists followed the principles that we'd had ever since the American Civil War and decided that the value of a human life was paramount. They chose to be pacifist, they chose to be conscientious objectors, and the other issue that rose for them, of course, was keeping the Sabbath. So the sacredness of life and strong views on Sabbath observance. We could tell the stories of many of them. 17 young men, such as Pastor Hector Bull and Charles Meredith and others, spent time in Dartmoor prison. Some were better treated than others, but it was a harsh regime. Conscientious objection was not an easy option. Garth Till, he is the son of one of those conscientious objectors, Willie Till. He put it very simply. In fact, Willie Till, his father ended up in a court-martial in France as was sent to a military prison. And his dad simply stated that prison had to be worse than the trenches simply to discourage deserters. Now, the media is full at the moment, and in the next month it will fill up even more as we move towards the 4th of August and the 100th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. You've seen the pictures, you've seen the film footage, and those trenches were not nice places to be. The military prisons had to be worse. Can you imagine what it was like to be a conscientious objector? The treatment of conscientious objectors in Dartmoor prison was actually debated in the House of Lords on the 30th of April 1918, and Lord Parmore moved a resolution that stated that the non-combatant work of conscientious objectors should be of national service and value and not merely of penal character. And he described during the debates the work at Dartmoor, which consisted of men building a wall only to be followed by another group of men knocking the wall back down again. There are many other things we could describe about Dartmoor, but you probably don't want to hear them just after breakfast. However, Charles Meredith told his story to Glyn, his son, who's still alive and living near Carmarthen, that if you worked hard there, you were respected. And he was one of those that broke up large blocks of granite that they dragged in off Dartmoor and used a sledgehammer to bash them into little bits that were then used for road building. And on Sabbaths, he was actually given the freedom to walk to church 15 miles each way, from the middle of Dartmoor down to Plymouth and back again. If we want to focus on Adventist heroes, our attention really needs to go to 16 young men who were either training at Stanborough College or living in the environments of Stanborough Park, working at the sanatorium at the time, or at Grano's or the printing press. And these 16 were conscripted into the 3rd Eastern Non-Combatant Corps at Bedford Barracks on the 23rd of May 1916. And soon after, 14 of them were sent to France. It was on the boat that the trouble started. They'd been given their uniforms, and on the boat, on the way over to France, they were handed rifles. They refused to pick up the rifles. They were in a non-combatant corps, but they were given rifles, they refused to take them. The sergeant didn't know what to do with them, and so when they got to Le Havre, these 14 young men were just put on one side of the quay, and someone was left there to guard them, and they didn't know what to do with them. After a few hours, they thought, well, we better do something with them. And so Armstrong, who was the tallest and kind of the hulkiest of them, said, let's make an example of him. And so they made him go and pick up a pile of rocks at one side of the quay and carry them over to the other side of the quay, heavy, big rocks. And when he'd finished, they said, okay, put them back again. That already started to affect his health. However, despite that bad start, accommodations were made, and for a period of about 18 months, these men were able to work principally as stevedores on the dockside in various locations, unloading munitions and different things from the ships that supplied the troops, and they were given Sabbath privileges. And it worked well, until In fact, it worked so well that there's a photo here. You can see this picture. If you look at the next one, that's the same group in fancy dress. You know, when I first got this photo, when I was going through the archives, I thought, what's this, in a military prison? Well, it wasn't. This is while they were working in the docks, and obviously there was some kind of social event, and they were able to dress up in fancy dress and enjoy it. However, it wasn't all like that. Things changed in 1917. They were moved to a new area with a new commander, and they were told they will have to work on Sabbath. This they jointly refused to do. There wasn't a ringleader, they just all decided together, we're not going to work on Sabbath. It had serious consequences. They were court-martialed, and that's the court-martial that you can see there. That's the stamp in Jimmy McGreechy's book, and they all had the same, sentenced to 6 months hard labor in military camp number 3 in Le Havre. Writing years later to a young man who asked about the experience, Wellesley Armstrong wrote, "I won't go into the details of the horrible treatment we received, but finally each one of us was cast into a small cell, approximately 7 foot by 4 foot, with iron walls and a concrete floor. It was midwinter. There, after punishment, our hands were placed behind our backs and locked with what was called figures of 8. This was very painful." That is called English understatement. Alfred Bird, that you can see here, he died early in 1944, partly as a result of ill health resulting from the appalling treatment that he received. His daughter said that the marks of the irons digging into his wrists could be seen until the day he died. Armstrong developed a heart condition even in prison and lived with the serious consequences of the treatment for the rest of his life. In fact, one of the children that I talked to said Armstrong was so damaged by the beatings that he couldn't have a family. I've talked with a number of the children of these characters. Their parents did not talk after this experience. They didn't tell their families what happened to them. They would talk to each other, but they wouldn't talk to people outside, because how do you understand, experience what they actually went to? Willie Till broke that rule just once, just before Christmas in 1938. The Second World War was looming. Garth, that you can see in the picture here, was 9 years old at the time, and he remembers it well. Willie's sister had scolded him. "War is coming, you need to tell us what happened. There's lessons that we need to learn." And so Willie spent the afternoon and the evening recounting what happened to him in the First World War. Garth then told me that his dad suffered nightmares and trauma for the next month just from having relived those accounts. I'm not going to give you those nightmares. The fullest accounts, which I'll put in a document on the website that you'll be able to see. It's in the 4th of April 1918 edition of the clandestine newspaper, The Tribunal. The Bodleian Library in Oxford has one of only 2 copies still extant, and they kindly sent me a photograph of them. Suffice it to say, when you read this account, it talks about bullying, breaking men's hearts, that they were authorized to use physical means to achieve their objectives. And on that first Friday afternoon in the prison courtyard, the Adventists downed tools at 4 p.m. in preparation for Sabbath. The sergeants were ready. They had their sticks, they had their revolvers, they had their boots, and they laid in to those 14 young men. They beat them. They dragged them to the cells. As they were dragging them, they were tripping them up. When they were in the cells, they beat them again. And then they were left in their cells with the figures of 8 tightly clamped on their wrists behind their backs, digging into them. In fact, they said they put figures of 8 on them that were actually too small for them on purpose, so that it actually dug in and damaged the flesh. Such mistreatment continued the next day. And according to the accounts in the tribunal, But it's actually W. W. Armstrong's personal letter 40 years later that inspires me. And that's the reason I would really want to share this with you this morning, because I'm going to read some of it to you. He says that when the Sabbath morning came, I remember hearing the door of the cell on my right, being opened, and the sergeant giving instructions to one of our young men to go to work. I couldn't hear his reply, but I did hear him leave the cell and the door was bolted. The same thing happened to the youth on the other side, and I was left by myself. I heard other doors opened and then bolted. And then finally, the door to my cell was opened, and I was commanded to go to work. I refused to do this in a courteous way, explaining once more the reason for my refusal. I fully expected to be thrashed and beaten, but to my surprise, the sergeant was quite affable. He told me not to be a fool, that all the other young men had come to their senses and they'd all gone to work as good Britishers should, and that I would only get into further trouble if I was stubborn. This news, of course, surprised me, and I could hardly believe it, he writes. But I remember making the statement that whatever my brethren might do, I must remain firm to the truth of God. And I endeavored to get some sort of spiritual understanding into the mind of that gross sergeant. I learned later, however, that all of our young men had actually remained faithful. The sergeant then changed his attitude and the inevitable beating came, but that wasn't the end of the story. Armstrong writes, a short while afterwards, a little way down the corridor, I heard somebody whistling one of our well-known hymns, although I couldn't remember which one it was. I was surprised to hear this because to whistle or sing was counted as gross insubordination. But to my surprise, I heard a voice singing with the whistling, and it was only a question of seconds before many other voices joined in singing this hymn, and I found myself spontaneously joining in the singing of that good old hymn. Armstrong noted that the singing of that hymn brought wonderful comfort and strength to us as we were there in that prison. It had an effect on in fact, the sergeant was so angry he didn't know what to do. And some other non-commissioned officers came into the corridor with him, and they didn't know what to do either. And so they basically stood there, and they became very subdued. And Armstrong reports, when we finished that hymn, it was in an atmosphere of absolute quiet. While much of the horror of that time fell away over the years, that moment remained. Even 40 years on, Armstrong could recount it with clarity. There was something in the hymn itself, he wrote, as well as the spirit in which it was sung, that affected those brutal men, for brutal they were to the extreme. And although we did experience considerable persecution subsequently, I felt that these men had far more respect for us after they'd heard our singing. There was another issue. The men were not allowed Bibles. You know, that's not something in the British Army, where you have chaplains, where you have Sunday services. But these men, because they saw it as a religious principle, were not permitted Bibles. But one of them, and I don't know which one it was, managed to smuggle a Gospel of John into the prison. And he was scared that it would be found, so that Gospel of John they actually ripped into 14 different sections and gave each man a section, and they hid that gospel in their caps. And even though they were manacled with the clasp behind their backs, and Garth was explaining this to me, when there were no guards around, they would knock their head forward, and the cap would fall off, and the gospel would be there, and they would read a bit. And then when the guard was heard coming, they'd stick their head down and get the cap back on their head. And so they were still able to have some spiritual food. They probably knew the Gospel of John off by heart by the end of that time in prison. A chaplain from a neighboring camp was passing the prison one day and heard their screams. He entered the prison and asked to see the Adventists. He knew that they were there, and he knew their character because previous to their arrest, they'd been faithful, conscientious workers. His request was refused, and after that, he wasn't even allowed in the prison where he used to regularly take a weekly worship. It may possibly be him that raised the alarm with higher authorities back here in Great Britain, but certainly the authorities found out. And by January 1918, the British Union Committee wrote to the War Office in protest about the treatment that their young men were receiving. They were told that the matter had already been investigated, that the commanding officers had been disciplined and punished. We have no idea what that punishment was. We have no evidence for it. I'll tell you why in a second. But thankfully, after little more than a month in military prison number 3, their detention there came to an end. They were shipped back to England, and they were released from the army. They were sent to Knutsford Work Centre, which actually was another prison, but with a lot more freedom. And by the 14th of July, they were all released to civilian life. The lives of at least 2 of them were shortened because of the cruel punishment they received. And yet many of these conscientious and faithful Seventh-day Adventists went on to lead the church both in this country and in mission service overseas. H.W. Lowe was British Union president before and during the Second World War. W.W. Armstrong also served as Union president after the Second World War. Jesse Clifford and Willie Till both went as missionaries to West Africa. G. Norris became manager of Granos Foods and later became a pioneer factory builder in South America. A.F. Bird and others were local pastors, district pastors in various parts of the British Isles. So was Jimmy McGreechy, who also went as a missionary to the Middle East and served the church there. And others served the church in different capacities. And they all became valiant spokesmen on behalf of the church and the God that they loved, the God that they were faithful to. And then particularly as you move up towards 1938, 1939, and world conflict raises its ugly head again, they speak out on the issue of conscription. And many of the pastors and the young men that were of conscription age in the Second World War can give thanks to these brave heroes in the First World War because of what they went through. They actually trained our young men how to appear at a tribunal. I was talking to Philip Anderson, Pastor Philip Anderson, who now retired and volunteers in the Adventist Discovery Centre just this week, and his father-in-law was one of those that was there in France. And he told me that when they went to the tribunals, they would be sitting there and there'd be 3 or 4 young men that would go before them, and the tribunal would thrash them and send them into the army. And then the Adventist young man would stand there and he would be represented by one of these people, and they would listen and they would say, okay, are you willing to go and serve in agriculture? Would you be willing to work in a medical position? If you're someone like Dr. Hugh Dunton, would you go down the mines? Can you imagine an academic, a man with a brilliant mind, spent the Second World War down a coal mine? But they could keep their pacifist position, their godly position of preserving life, because of the sacrifice that these young men had made. Valiant spokesmen who made the choice to stand for right, though the heavens fall. We may never know the full story, because I've discovered in my research that the government side of that story is locked up in the National Archives until 2042. So those of you that love conspiracy theories, no, please don't go that route. But I'm told things like that are only locked at that length if it's about spies, if it's about traitors, if it's about national security. And so there's something there that the government is still embarrassed about. An application was put in about 18 months ago by Dr. David Trim. At that time, it just says archive closed. He then went back later, and as you can see, it's now closed till 2042. I've just put in a Freedom of Information request, and I'm waiting to hear. Well, they have to reply. I'm just waiting to hear what that reply is going to be. But you've listened to that story this morning, and that story can be repeated and has been repeated in many ways in many other parts of the world. In my job as a journalist, both in my current role and in what I used to do with Adventist World Radio, I've talked with genocide survivors from Rwanda. I've talked to people who've survived atrocities in Bosnia and Croatia in times past. I've talked to people from the former Soviet bloc whose Christian faith was taxed to the limits. And that kind of persecution is still going on in too many places in the world today, in Pakistan, in Syria, in Somalia, isn't it, where this young lady has just been released and then arrested again. But really, the story is one for us. Somewhere, sometime, we have to make difficult choices. And the story of these young men actually reminds me of a challenge faced by another very timid young man back in the days of the Judges. In Judges chapter 6, we read the story of Gideon, a scared young man. He's hiding in a wine press to thresh corn. I don't know if any of you are farmers, but you don't thresh corn in a wine press. It's just difficult, but he's trying to hide from the enemy. But the angel of the Lord appears to him as he's hiding from the enemy, and he calls out to him, and he calls him, and he says, "You valiant warrior, the Lord is with you." In the King James Version, you're probably more familiar with that. It says, "Thou mighty man of valor." Was he? When you read the story, it doesn't look like it. It almost looks like God's having a joke with Gideon. Because Gideon immediately questions God in verse 13. He confesses the family's weakness in verse 15. He asks for a miracle in verse 17. And while he builds up some courage to destroy the altar to Baal there on his father's land, he still does it at night so nobody can see him. And by the end of the chapter, we see he sets two more tests for God with a fleece that's got to be dry or a fleece that's got to be wet. And God humors him. He's a scared young man, but God calls him a mighty man of valor. And God humors him because God knows he can use him. God also challenges him, reducing the army that he then recruits of 32,000 men, and that's to face a lot of enemy, but 32,000, maybe they can just do it. And so God reduces it to 10,000. And even that's too many. God reduces it to 300. And God can use 300. God can use you. God can use 14 young men in France. He can do mighty things with them. He can do mighty things with you and with me. Those 14 young men who stood by their principles in France, I believe, have to be admired. There are Adventist heroes. The many more who served in Dartmoor, Wakefield, Knutsford Prison, who stood firm despite Lord Kitchener's pressure that your country needs you, must be respected. It wasn't easy for them. And I have to confess to you now, because I didn't want to tell you this at the beginning, that when I started doing the research on this, it got very personal for me, because that young man in the bottom right corner there is my great uncle. I didn't know that he was there in that military prison in France. He's an Adventist hero. I hold them all as Adventist heroes, and as Adventists, we need heroes. And so, as we conclude, a thought for the future. It may be difficult to know what choices we're going to have to make for the future. In a TV documentary that I'm making, that we hope to release for the 4th of August, about these young men, I also interview some Adventists today who are serving in the military. And I respect them. They have made a choice. But it's a different choice than the choice that these 14 or the larger group of 130 made back in World War I. We've maybe moved from a corporate Adventist world to one where individualism means more. One young man that I talked to who's serving in the RAF said, yeah, my church didn't approve of what I'm going to do, but I prayed about it and God opened the door, so it must be all right. And he's a lovely young man, and he's a Christian young man. And he confessed to me, I don't know whether those words are going to appear in the program or not, but he said to me, you know, if the enemy was standing in front of me with a rifle, I'll shoot him before he shoots me. Now, I'm troubled by that, you know. When my great uncle there is willing to die rather than take somebody else's life. When there are so many other Adventists, and if you move to World War II, you'll meet people like Desmond Doss and others who served in a non-military capacity, a non-combative capacity, to save lives rather than take them. What of our future? Whether or not you agree with Worsley Armstrong and his colleagues, what is perhaps more important is for me to think through the moral issues that affect my life, that influence my faith, for me to be making positive choices now in times when it's easy, to be living my faith now so that I can claim those words of Joshua, you mighty man of valor, you mighty lady of valor. Together we can be people of valor. The Lord is with you, you valiant warrior. I started with a quote. I want to go back to it at the end. We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history. You've had a history lesson this morning, but I believe, more importantly, you've had a lesson of faith, a lesson of conscience, a lesson of standing for freedom, standing for right, though the heavens fall. It may be a history lesson. My main question is, how does it touch your life today, 2014? Looking back 100 years, the TV, the media, the hype around World War I. What difference, what story are you going to tell your family, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, standing for right, though the heavens fall? Amen.